You're listening to This Cockeyed War podcast, the story of Lieutenant Albert Edwin Haines, G Company, 2nd Battalion, 47th Infantry Regiment, 9th Infantry Division. Chapter 5, Everything Normal, SNAFU. Welcome back, everybody. We are moving forward with Lieutenant Ed Haynes' experience in World War II. We've now gotten past the rest and recuperation, and we're coming back into the front lines. Today is going to be a little bit more of a macro level discussion. Dad, can you give us a picture of what's happening during this time? Specifically, I guess this is between kind of the middle of December into January, where Grandpa is during the Battle of the Bulge, which we've all heard about and talked about. Give us some background. What's going on at this time?
All right, so we're talking about, let's just talk like the first part of December 1944. The Allies have pushed as far forward as they can based on their logistics support. We've talked about that before. One of the problems still was they still didn't have a large port open yet, although I think they managed to finally they took Antwerp, which is on the channel. They took Antwerp, Belgium, I think in like mid-November. But the problem was they didn't take the estuary into Antwerp, and so the Germans still held the long shipping channel from the channel into the port. And it took the Canadians quite a while to clear that out, and General Montgomery and whatever army he was leading at that time had the Canadians with him, and they were supposed to clear that. And it took them quite a while to do that. So they're still running things through Normandy and some of the smaller ports that they had been able to take. And it was still pretty hard to keep the force going forward. So basically, the Allies have advanced about as far as they can, and they're at the borders of Germany, of the fatherland. They're at what they call the West Wall, which is a line of a fortified line that Hitler and the Germans had built like before the war even started, with pillboxes and dragon's teeth and that kind of stuff. And there was real concern about whether the Allies would be able to punch through that fortified line. And plus the fact, as you push the enemy back, their lines get shorter. So they don't have to go as far to get their logistics while yours are getting stretched out. So that's sort of an imperative that you have to remember, and we saw it play out quite a bit in North Africa between Rommel on the German side and Montgomery on the British side. Back and forth across the desert they'd go, and they'd beat each other, and they'd go miles and miles and miles and miles, and then, but it's all because of logistics. They couldn't get their stuff forward. So the Allies are about as far as they can go, and Hitler decides that he needs to sort of do one big last roll of the dice. And I'm going to say it's Hitler because I don't think his generals thought much of the idea. And he decides that what they should do is they should surprise the Allies, punch a hole in their line, and advance to Antwerp. Basically, cut off their supply route. Of course, that requires a lot of coordination and planning on the part of the Germans, and they did a superb job. They attacked again through the Ardennes, which is what they did at the beginning of the war and also in World War I. And they managed to mass several panzer divisions and corps there, along with mechanized infantry. And on the 16th of December, they launched their surprise attack at 5:30 in the morning. And so that's sort of the big picture. And they launched that attack. And in fact, if you turn to page 191 in This Cockeyed War, there's a good map there that shows you what the German battle plan was and how they're going to make things bad for the Allies. Grandpa, as we've just talked about, has just come out of rest and recuperation, and he's up back in the area they were before, near Frenzburg and Langelinie and Longuevaille and those areas up there just south of Aachen. And they're getting ready to go on the offensive, and they're doing some training when the Battle of the Bulge starts, where the Germans attack. So that's sort of where we're at.
What's Dad's proximity to all this? Like, what are the distances that we're dealing with as far as where Dad's going and where this German offensive is moving through? And how much awareness did Grandpa have while this huge historical war event was happening?
Yeah. If you examine his war, if you will, his combat, it was all of about 29 miles long and probably about 20 miles in width at the most. I've sort of laid that over the top of Utah Lake there in Utah, and it's like going from Lehigh around the east side of the lake down to Goshen is about how long his combat area was. And so when we talk about where he was at the beginning of the Bulge and where he ended up, he was north in that area where they'd just been fighting, getting trained up to go on the offensive. On the 16th, they get notified there's some challenges in the south, so he goes all the way down, like 28, 29 miles, to Monschau. And so basically, it's not a very big area. You can drive it in a car in probably 30 minutes or 35 minutes. That's with traffic, too. And so it really, there wasn't that big of an area. So the Germans broke through in the 8th Corps area, which was south of the corps that Grandpa was in. In essence, when Grandpa moved that 28, 29 miles to the south and they took up their position, they were holding the north shoulder. Now, we talk about north shoulder, we're talking about you're not facing into the Bulge. You're facing the shoulder that connects that bulge, and you're trying to keep the bulge from getting wider. So Grandpa's unit and those that are up there on the north shoulder are attempting to hold that line to keep the Germans from making the bulge bigger. And they do a very good job. In essence, General Eisenhower says, we have an opportunity here. They're going to expend a lot of resources doing this offensive. All we need to do is contain the hole and not necessarily let them run wild in the rear area, but contain the hole and keep them blocked in. And when they run out of steam, then we can pinch them off. Well, to make a long story short, and I'm going to jump to the end here real quick, Eisenhower didn't do that. He didn't pinch him off. Instead, he pushed the bulge back where it was. And some people say that's not very smart from a tactical, strategic, operational level, but that's what he did, and there was just a lot of that kind of stuff. So anyway, Grandpa's on the north shoulder, holding that area to keep it from getting wider and keep the Germans from pushing, making the break wider to the north. So that's where Grandpa ended up when he came south on this order. Now, what did he know about it? I don't think he knew a whole lot. He's up there in a reserve position, doing some training, getting ready for future operations that were going to be to the west of where they were, or the east of where they were, sorry. And they weren't thinking about some other place. Their war is, like I said this before, 20 meters to the front and maybe 40 meters to the rear and 40 meters on each side. And that's about the extent of their vision. And that's what Grandpa's vision was. Unless somebody came along and said, we're going to do something different, which is what happened on the 16th of December. So if we look at the timeline here, on the 16th of December, 1944, that was a Saturday. At 5:30 in the morning, the Germans start their attack. We know that based on reports that were given today. But to get a sense and feel for this, the logs from the 47th Infantry Regiment begin to indicate there's some activity going on. And so, for example, the Germans attack at 5:30. That's not recorded anywhere on their log because they weren't attacked. The 47th was not attacked because they were too far north. But at 7:15, the log says, oh, there's German planes that were noticed flying around. At 5:25 that afternoon, and remember now it's starting to get dark because we're in the middle of the winter, 7th Corps, which is the corps that the 9th Infantry Division is in, mentions that there's an attack going on to the south of them. And then at 5 minutes to 6 that afternoon, the log indicates that the attack was taking place in 8th Corps area, which was just south of 7th Corps. By 7 o'clock that evening, and it's dark, 8th Corps says, according to the log, we got it in hand, don't worry about it, everything's okay. So they sort of say, okay, that's great. So everybody sort of stands down a little bit in the 7th Corps area. Well, we know that, in fact, it was not great. It was sort of getting pretty messy down there, but they didn't know because it's like we talked about earlier, when you go into offensive action and actions, things get very confusing. Finally, on the 17th of December, which is a Sunday, there's reports of enemy planes that are dropping parachutists in the Aachen area. And that's the word that comes down from 7th Corps that tells the 47th, stop your training. All the training's been canceled and stay in your area. So in other words, something's going on. We got to find out what's going on. So at 9 o'clock, the enemy attacks and is successful in 5th Corps area to the south, and 8th Corps is also in a bad way because they finally said, we lost 6 miles on a 10-mile front. So that's a pretty big hole that the 8th Corps has suffered. At 10:15, Grandpa's regiment is notified they got to find trucks and move south. And by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they're on their way down to Monschau to be on the North Shoulder. And that's sort of where we're at. And again, so we're barely 1 day into this operation by the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge, and that's what's happened. Things aren't good. Things are very confusing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's marked in here in the logs. It talks about on December 17th, Grandpa was ordered to march 3 miles along the highway to meet trucks which carried troops 38 miles to the western edge of the village of Mutzenich.
Something like that.
And then it says considerable confusion last few miles due to lack of information of enemy and crowds of civilians blocking the road. Troops deployed and dug into defensive positions for the night. So I can imagine it's dark. You don't know really what's going on, but you can see the results of something happening by refugees on the road. I'm sure they're hearing things as well. And then they're getting notifications of paratroopers landing in different areas. And that could mean anything. That could mean somebody's behind you now. Pretty unnerving. Yeah,
there's an interesting story, and some of this is captured in This Cockeyed War with a quote from, it's a Time for Trumpets. Grandpa sort of dug into this, and there's a story about of the German paratroopers. The commander was Van der Heide, and his unit was supposed to drop. And in essence, if they had been in position and had gotten there, they would have blocked that road and kept Grandpa and his unit from moving south to be where they were. The problem was Van der Heide's unit was just sort of scraped off the front line because they hadn't done parachute operations in quite a while. They were green. They were pretty well untrained because they hadn't had the opportunity to do anything about it. The Luftwaffe that flew the planes to drop them didn't do a good job, dropped them all over the countryside. So here he's got this probably a good-sized parachute unit, like 300 to 500 men, that are scattered everywhere. He manages to pull some of them together, but he doesn't have enough firepower to stop the traffic going south to protect the shoulder. And so he basically has to let these guys go. I mean, he has to let the trucks go and the tanks go because he doesn't have any firepower. He's got troops his paratroopers are scattered everywhere. So finally he says, after about a day or two of trying to assemble, he says, this isn't working. We got to get out of here. We're supposed to be able to go to Monschau, which is supposed to be in German hands. That was the battle plan. And so when all else fails, you don't know what's going on, follow the plan. So Van der Heide tells his soldiers, break yourselves up into groups of 2 or 3 and escape and evade, E&E is what we call it in the military, escape and evade your way back to Monschau through the Allied line so you can get picked up by friendly German forces. And so during this whole story about Grandpa moving and setting up and what's going on the front line, they're not getting a whole lot of necessarily Germans advancing from the east. Their biggest action is these paratroopers trying to infiltrate back through the lines because right there where they end up near Monschau is where these paratroopers are trying to get through. So it's just a interesting story. When Uncle Doug and Uncle Al and I and our wives were there for that tour we had, we stopped in Monschau, and Yuri took us up to the house where Colonel von der Heydt finally ended up. And he was being treated by a German doctor there in the town, and he had frostbite and some other things, and he just wasn't doing well. And so finally they got a message out to the Americans there, the regiment, said, Colonel von der Heydt wants to surrender. And so they came and picked him up, and he couldn't walk because he had trench foot and everything else. Anyway, he was in a bad way, and they got him out of there. But he was not happy. He was not happy with the way the whole thing transpired and what he was not able to do with the garbage that the Germans had given him for units and that kind of stuff. So that was some of that action. And really, Grandpa would have never gotten down there if von der Heydt had been able to complete his mission. So it's an interesting little wrinkle to the story as we talk about this. So anyway, so it's confusion. They get down there, they got civilians everywhere because they don't know what's going on either, and they're moving from where the Bulge and the fighting is going on, and you've got units that were part of that front line that just got blasted through by the advancing Germans, and they're either killed or lost or running around. Their leaders are gone. They don't know where anybody is, and they're just stumbling around in the dark. It's confusion. And so the 47th arrives, and on their way down, they pick up all these stragglers, if you will, because that's what they are. They're stragglers. There's no order to them, and they're just pieces and parts of units. And what's interesting is as you read this, you begin to see how the 47th takes these pieces and parts that are out there, and because they're the only sort of intact, structured, organized military unit in the area, they take all these fragments and they begin to put together what they call a task force. And you begin to take these things and you fold them into what you're doing. So, for example, there's a discussion about the 395th, I think it's the 3rd Battalion of the 395th Regiment, and they're from a totally another division, and they're sort of intact, and so they get attached to the 47th and they take orders from the 47th. And so they're there anyway, so there's some engagements going on. You've got little recon units. There's a 99th Reconnaissance Troop, I think. And they somehow or another, and I've got to dig more into this, they somehow or another got involved with a fight with one of the German units that was supposed to advance through there. And anyway, they got surrounded. And so the 47th had to come and rescue them. And if I remember right, the commander of the reconnaissance troop was almost sort of relieved by Colonel Smythe, but they finally said, let's let the 395th take care of them because they're part of the same division and they can do what they want with them. And so, I mean, there's just this chaos and confusion. And this is all happening in like just hours and days from each other. So anyway, so they're going through and picking up these units, and all of a sudden they begin to see, wow, we got new equipment here. The 47th. And what happens is when you pick up these units and you give soldiers directions, morale goes up. Somebody's in charge. Somebody can make a decision. Somebody that knows more about what's supposed to be going on than I know will listen to what they have to tell us, and we'll do what they tell us to do. Because right now we don't know what we're supposed to do. So it's just sort of interesting. They get an MP unit, a troop of MP armored cars. And they've got mounted machine guns on those, so they can use those for mobile action if they need to plug gaps. They've got a battery of Bofors guns, which are basically air defense guns, an air defense unit that also has 50 caliber machine guns, and those are heavy machine guns, and so those are nice to have. So they put those in through the unit. There's a company of 105 millimeter howitzers. They're towed. The problem is, there's nothing to tow them because the vehicles that were towing them evacuated people when the Germans came through and punched the hole. So these guns they can't go anywhere. And so if you have prime movers and you can go move them and put them where you want them, then you've got some artillery that you didn't have before. And so it's a plus and a minus. So there's the very dynamic, rough stuff going on.
Yeah, talk to us more about, you put together this presentation, I guess a few years ago, where you talk more about the leadership on the North Shoulder and some figures there that helped raise the morale of the troops just by giving direction. I mean, when there's not any direction and confusion, I can see, one confident voice saying we're going to go from point A to point B, or we're going to do this thing, can really help people out.
So you've got Colonel Smythe, who's the commander of the 47th Infantry Regiment, and the units that are attached to it. Like there's usually an artillery battalion with it and some other things. And so that's moving south. They may have a platoon of tanks. They probably have some tank destroyers that are generic, organic to the 47th Infantry Regiment team, combat team they call it. And so then as they're going down and picking up these scattered units, they're getting all this other additional stuff. And because Colonel Smythe in the 47th, he's the highest ranking person down there with an organized unit, these other people being out of communication with their higher organization are now prepared to say, okay, we'll do what this guy tells us to do. And you begin to get established communications. And what the 47th is able to do is identify these fragments of units and send that up to the 9th Infantry Division, which then goes up to the Corps, so they begin to sort out where these people are and what they're doing. And so, but still for several days, these units are going to be working with the 47th. So just this voice in the wilderness saying, this is what you need to do. And people just sort of fall in line. What's interesting about this, though, at the very highest level, because the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge managed to push through the American, I don't remember what army is, First Army or Second Army group or something like that. They had the theater divided up. On the north was Montgomery, the British, and the Canadians. In the center, you had two American armies, and they also had a piece of the French there in the south. And so what happened was when the Germans hit, is they took Bradley's army group and they punched a hole in it. And Bradley's headquarters was to the south of the hole, and part of his army units, his corps, were up here north of the hole. And so these guys up here on the north can't communicate with their commander because the Germans have cut the communication lines, if you will. And so they don't know what they're supposed to do either. So Eisenhower, for a little while, basically does something that no U.S. commander had ever done. He put U.S. troops under a foreign general. What he did is he took that corps and a half that was on the north side, which Grandpa was in, and put them under Montgomery's command while this whole thing was going on, because he needed to have that connection with him. And so it lasted probably, I don't know, maybe a week or two. And then when they got a handle on it, they pushed the Germans back, and it got back to what it was, where Americans were under Americans and all that other kind of stuff. But it's one of those things that happens in war. You just got to sort of figure it out. The other thing to remember here too is if the 47th and Grandpa and those staggle of units had not held their position and allowed the Germans to get through, they could have potentially come in and rooted out the artillery that had set up along what's became known as Elsenborn Ridge, which in essence lined the north. It was high ground that ended up lining the north shoulder of the Bulge as it extended into the Allied lines. And they were able to bring in a lot of heavy artillery. And because the weather was so bad, the tactical air force couldn't fly. So the only thing they had was long-range artillery, and they put a lot of it up there on the north shoulder, on the Elsenborn Ridge. And Grandpa and his unit, protecting that north shoulder, allowed those artillery units to be very effective at hitting the German forces that had entered the Bulge and were trying to expand the advance up toward Antwerp. So Grandpa may not have been in the thick of it, but he certainly did help thicken up the thick of it with American artillery by defending that north shoulder with his unit in the 47th. So it's chaos, but there's order in the chaos if you follow the order. So basically now, Grandpa's there in the Monschau area. The battle of the Bulge settles down after 4 or 5 or 6 days, and the Germans run out of their logistic support and they have to stop their advance. And basically then the Americans and the Allies push the Bulge back. And during this time frame, Grandpa's just up there in a defensive position. And there's dynamics with that too, because you set up your defensive position. You're not even sure if you're in the right spot. You're not sure if you're too far forward or too far back, because it's a very fluid situation. So you see a couple times where he has to move some of his positions around. I sense that Grandpa didn't necessarily care much for his company commander. He talks about Grandpa put his outposts further out, meaning they were further out to the front so that they could give more warning sooner, and maybe depending on the terrain and where you put them, that's what he did. But his company commander came around and said, no, pull them closer. Well, the next day the colonel comes out, Colonel Smythe, and says, no, move them out. And I think Grandpa called it a SNAFU, which was one of those abbreviations that means much more than the snap. Anyway. And he also said that the company commander tend to drink at the wrong times. So there's some of that stuff. And he had a challenge there too. That it's now like it's the 20th, the 21st, the 22nd, and Christmas is coming. He talks about, I guess they got a hot meal. I read that somewhere where they got a hot meal. Where did I read that? Is that one of the...
Yeah, I think his journal entry on the 25th of December shows some of his frustrations coming up.
Yeah. In fact, the log from the after action report of the 2nd Battalion talks about the 25th, no change. In other words, they're still holding their line. Enemy combat patrol of approximately 30 men attacked, et cetera, et cetera. Talks about here, occasional heavy shelling harassed the entire area. So you always got to be on your guard because you don't know what the Germans are doing. He says, an excellent turkey dinner was served, with the hot food being carried to all of the men in the forward positions after dark. And then Grandpa talks about in his journal or in his letter or something, he talks about losing half of his dinner, his Christmas dinner, because he had to extend the line.
Yeah. Let me read that for everybody here. First, I'll set it up. That Christmas Eve on the 24th, he writes, spent Christmas Eve digging holes and setting up positions. Bed at 300 on Monday. So he's digging holes and setting up positions. He's not going to bed on Christmas Eve until 3 a.m. And then if you look the next day, December 25th, up at 06:30. So goes to bed at 3. He has to get up at 6:30. Up at 6:30 and rechecked all positions before daylight. Hand carried breakfast out. In afternoon, had to extend 600 yards to meet F Company. So he was probably ordered, okay, go extend now.
Now that's a gap in the line. You better close that gap.
Right. And then he keeps writing, made me mad. So much so, I threw away half a good dinner. Turkey, dressing, spuds, cake, etc. Cockeyed war. Got men working after dark and carried logs myself to set up new holes. Bed at 1 a.m. 0100. Feeling awful blue and lonely. Gee, what a horrible Christmas this has been. Maybe soon comes peace and happiness. And I got to review the letters to see if that frustration came through the letters, but you can just tell just by the time he purposely puts those timestamps in to let people know what he's going through on 3 hours of sleep.
Yeah. In some ways, it shows the caliber of your grandfather and his leadership ability in getting down with the men. He probably didn't think much of having to extend his line because he probably had extended it once before and they said pull it back, and so somebody's either telling him extend it anyways. But he keeps that to himself, and he just basically goes out and helps his men do what they need to do and suffer along with them to a significant degree. And that's leadership. That's leadership. He also talks about motivated rebellious squad. I guess they've sort of said, we're not going to fix... I don't know exactly what the situation was, but I think it's like the roof caved in on their dugout or something like that. And they were mad and rebellious and said, we're not going to do this, we're going to go back. But that didn't happen anyway. So he went out and helped them fix their hole.
This is nice to read. This is a letter from one of his men on the 18th of January. So this is after kind of all of this slog goes through. But he quotes, my officers are fine men. For instance, The lieutenant directly over me, which is Grandpa, he is in my estimation all that one could ask for in the way of an officer. He is unceremonious and cooperative to the extent of even pitching in and helping the men in the dirty job of digging a foxhole in the mud. So that did not go unnoticed.
No, yeah. You know, we talk about the liquor ration. I had a story told me when I got to 3rd Armored Division. I was just a young lieutenant, second lieutenant, and the lieutenant colonel I was working for had worked for Dad when he was a captain. And he said, "Lieutenant Haines, I knew your dad. He's a great man." He said, "I also know he didn't drink." He said, "But I still remember the time at a unit picnic where they bring out a garbage can, a big metal garbage can with ice and beer in it, beer cans. And it's part of the picnic. They've it's a morale thing. They played baseball or, something, and they've got stuff from the mess hall that they're cooking up, and it's hot dogs and hamburgers or something like that. And he said, "I remember your dad reaching in that garbage can with all that ice, that cold can, pull out a can of beer, pop the lid, and hand it out to the troops." And you go, my dad passing out beer? It goes back to that interview that he had with the BYU guy, You got to help your unit be the best unit it can be. I think that's a leadership lesson that World War II taught him in spades with this kind of stuff going on. And better to be in a defensive position than have to go on the offense and that kind of stuff. And in fact, he talks about how crowded the platoon command post gets because everybody wants to come to the platoon command post. And he finally goes, I'm going out. There's too much going on. It's too much smoke in here, too much mess. And so he's a leader. He's a leader.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. Dad, anything else you want to include on this section before we kind of wrap up into the kind of the final chapter of Grandpa's experience?
I think this is probably a good place to stop. I was gonna talk about the weather, but I think we should save that for next time because it comes to play significantly into what happens leading up to his wounding. And so I think we'll just hang on to that. But understand that as of right now, he's in a defensive position, and it's cold and miserable in December. One of the things I found really interesting when I was doing my part of putting together this cockeyed war is, and I think I learned this when we lived in Germany, you go, when it says 4:30 in the afternoon, you think, oh, okay, we've got another 3 hours of daylight. Not in northern Germany, you don't. It's already dark. And so it's one of those things where I made a point whenever I got to another day, I'd look at what Grandpa would write, because he would usually write what the weather condition was, cloudy or cold or snowy or whatever it was. But I could also go back with the blessing of Google, if you will, and I could see when the sun up and sundown was on that day in northern Germany, close within a couple of minutes anyway. It was always interesting to me as we get into the winter, how dark it is. And I may have shared this before, but let me share it again. I really didn't appreciate knowing what time it was when you read these stories about war until Sherry and I were on our mission in Fort Lee, Virginia, and we went to a reenactment where you have Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers, and they're reenacting the breakthrough, they call it, where the Union line finally was able to punch through the Confederate line at Petersburg during the Civil War. And so we go out there, and they said, if you want to do this, you got to come on the day it happened and the place it happened. And so we get there, and the attack started when they had this breakthrough, like at 5:30 in the morning in, I don't know, April or May. I can't remember exactly what the month was. But we get out there, and it is pitch black. And it was probably darker in 1865 than it was when we were there in 2017 or 18. because of the light noise that would be there. But it was dark. And so you read about this battle, about how the Vermont regiment finally made the assault and punched through the Confederate line. And you're out there and you're in the dark and you're sort of in a gallery area, but not really. And you see the reenactors coming across the field, but you don't see them. It is pitch black. And all you hear are the Confederates and the little flashes of musketry where the Confederate positions are supposed to be, and a few artillery booms. And then you don't even see these guys. I mean, it's dark. And you may hear noise, you may hear clanking of canteens and that kind of stuff. And they may be yelling at each other, but they're advancing. And you go, this is crazy. People do this stuff. Well, next week, we talk about Grandpa at 4:30 in the morning. Just remember how dark and cold it was.
All right. Bring your blankets, everybody.
There you go.
All right. Hey, thanks, Dad.
You bet. Next week.
This Cockeyed War is an SMC production. It is hosted and edited by me, Nathan Haines. My dad, retired Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Allen Haines, was the featured guest in this episode. The bugle call at the start of this episode was Morning Colors.